Okay, so this is tissues lecture part one of probably three parts. I'm going to try and keep it as short as I can. Um, this will cover sort of general tissues overview and then epithelial tissue. And then I'll do connective muscle and nerve and such in a different part. So here we go. So cells and tissues are the levels of organization that carry out all the chemical activities, metabolism, needed to sustain life. Okay, so cells are the building blocks of all living things. You probably remember that from biology. And then tissues are a group of cells similar in structure and function. So tissues work together to do a particular function, and then different tissue types together make up an organ. So we're looking at groups of similar cells, basically, when we talk about tissues. There are different types that we'll talk about. There are connective tissues, so cells that connect body parts in tendons or blood cells, cells that cover body organs. So today we'll be talking about epithelial cells. There are contractile cells, muscle cells, cells that store nutrients, so adipocytes, fat cells, store lipids for energy, disease-fighting cells, macrophages, cells for transmitting information. So this is a nerve cell. You can see it has that long axon to help transmit information. Reproductive cells. So different cells have different structures depending upon their function. Okay? And when they come together to make a tissue, we're going to see the same thing. Tissues are going to have different structures depending upon their function. So the four types that we are going to talk about are epithelial tissue, that's what we'll talk about today, connective tissue, that's what we'll talk about next time, and then muscle and nervous tissue, which I'll probably put together because they're shorter. So those four primary types are what make up you, really, living things in general. And they each do a particular job. So we're going to look at today how the structure contributes to the function, and also like what makes epithelial tissue different from other tissues. So here is kind of a brief overview of the different tissue types. Epithelial tissue lines surfaces of the body, so there's some skin. Muscle tissue is contractile, so the fibers can contract. Nervous tissue has those long projectiles that can help transmit information. Blood has cells in a liquid matrix. Bone and cartilage both are cells in a stiff, strong matrix. And then loose connective tissue is fibers in kind of a soft matrix. So epithelial, muscle, nerve, and then connective. Okay, so today we're talking about epithelial tissues. So epithelial tissues are found anywhere there are coverings. It's like the skin, for instance, the the first example that springs to mind. And then linings of things, so like the lining of the intestines and the esophagus and the mouth and the nose. All of those places are going to be covered in epithelial tissue, including like in the lungs, for instance. That's still a lining. So coverings and linings. And because of that, their functions are for protection. So your skin is protecting your body from the outside world. Absorption, so in the lungs or in the kidneys, for instance, there are there's epithelial tissue so that things can be absorbed and released. Um, Filtration, again, with the kidneys, things filter from the body to be collected as waste. And then for secretion, so there are certain epithelial tissues that produce mucus and things, like in the lining of the intestines, for example. So you'll see, again, the structures of these epithelial tissues will be connected to these four functions. So a tissue that's going to protect might be bigger and thicker than a part that is going to absorb, for instance. So be looking for structure and function relationships as we go through this. That's really the key theme of tissues, is really structure and function. So epithelium in general has cells that fit closely together. They look kind of like a puzzle, maybe. There's always a free surface, so open like to the air. So that's the apical surface. And then the lower surface, so deep to the apical surface, is the basal surface, and that rests on a basement membrane, which is loose connective tissue. Okay, so there's always one open to the air, and if you think about your skin, I mean, it's easy to kind of see that structure. Free surface of the skin, open to the air, and then deep to that is the basal surface. Epithelium is avascular, so it has no blood supply of its own, relies on diffusion. But if there is good nourishment, so if there is a lot of diffusion happening from the vascular tissues, then they regenerate easily. If you have ever gotten a paper cut or gotten scratched by a cat or whatever, you know how well like skin epithelium can regenerate. If you've burned your mouth eating pizza, same thing. So it does regenerate easily if it's well nourished. And we'll talk about tissue regeneration and repair all the way at the end of the tissue section, but epithelium does it well. So here's just a picture kind of showing the apical surface. The lumen is the inside of the intestines. Okay, so apical surface and then basal surface and connective tissue. So this is open to air or, food. And then this is attached. So epithelial tissue, and you saw this in the inquiry activity, is organized based on the number of layers. So simple epithelium has a single layer. Stratified epithelium has many layers, 2 or more technically, but usually it's many. So when we're talking about structure and function, right, what might the purpose of simple epithelium be? It's just a single layer, so it might let things cross that barrier relatively easily. So maybe absorption and filtration. Here we have many, many layers, so maybe that is more for protection. The other way the epithelium is classified is by the shape of the cell. So you'll see epithelial tissue tends to have two names, one for number of layers and then one for shape. So squamous is the top one, and that they're sort of squashed flat. You can see that's very flat. So I think of like squashed, squamous, both SQ. Cuboidal are kind of cube shaped. They're about as tall as they are wide. And then columnar, like a column, are taller than they are wide. And these, especially when you look at them under a microscope, as you will in the tissues lab, it does get a little bit tricky, especially with kind of these two, to tell them apart. But do your best. So we're going to start with simple epithelium. So simple squamous, first of all, has a single layer because it's simple. And simple squamous epithelium tends to form membranes, so lining body cavities, lining capillaries, the walls of the alveoli in the lungs. And in all of those cases, you need substances to be able to pass across the membrane. In the lungs, CO2 needs to get out, oxygen needs to get in. In the capillaries, same thing. CO2 needs to get out, oxygen needs to get in. So it's a very thin membrane in order for that to happen, for substances to cross it easily. Here's some pictures, and again, you'll see more pictures in the lab. Okay, here is simple cuboidals. You can see they're about as tall as they are wide. Simple, so single layer. They are common in glands and ducts, kidney tubules, for instance, covering the ovaries. So there's a little more protection. It's not as critical that things pass across a simple cuboidal membrane. Here in the collecting duct of the kidney, you can see lining there. The thyroid gland, you can see. And you can also see that, like, since these are actual micrographs, it's a little bit more challenging to see things. So just keep practicing, keep looking. Okay, simple columnar. So again, single layer. You can see these are much taller than they are wide, like a column. Single layer again, and these often come with goblet cells. Goblet cells produce mucus. So these line the digestive tract, secrete mucus to help, food move along smoothly. So a little bit more protection because they're a little bit bigger, but also that protection because of the secretion as well. Okay, here, this is in the gallbladder, and you can see they're very tall and not terribly wide. The dark purple is the nucleus. So you can see how close each of those nuclei are. You can also, in this picture, really nicely see the apical surface and then the basal surface with the connective tissue and some blood cells. Okay. So this is also simple epithelium, but it doesn't fit super nicely into our categories. This is going to be really a theme with anatomy. There's always some stuff that doesn't fit super nicely. So this is pseudostratified because it looks as if there might be two layers, a top layer and a bottom layer, because there's two areas where you find nuclei. but it's really just the way the cells are sort of squashed together. It's more of like it's like a tessellation, where they kind of flip to fit rather than being truly double layered. It's often ciliated, so there are cilia, those little moving fingers at the apical surface. So in the respiratory tract, for instance, you have the cilia to help sweep junk up and out, so it doesn't get down into the lungs. They might secrete mucus and things, or help absorb uh, fluids as well, so you get greater surface area. But it is one layer, it just looks like two. So pseudo is false, falsely stratified. So here you can see really nicely the cilia on the top. And then you can kind of see like there's a nucleus up there, and then there's some nuclei down there. So yeah, pseudo stratified. Okay, so those were all single layered. So now we're to stratified, many layered. And so for stratified squamous, this is where sometimes it gets a little tricky when you're looking at it, because if you look lower down, like toward the basal surface, you see cells that look almost cuboidal in shape. So you really have to look at the apical surface, the free edge, to see that they really are flattened. They really are squamous. Um, and stratified squamous, so it's many, many layers. And so that gives a lot of protection. So the function is forming protective coverings, because if something rubs along the apical surface, you've still got all of these cells that are still going to be there. So these occur in areas where there's lots of friction. I should say not fiction. Friction. So in the skin, they're constantly losing the top layer of skin cells, but there's many, many, many skin cells underneath. In the digestive tract, same thing. Food is kind of scraping through and scraping off that outermost layer, but there are plenty of cells underneath, so your body's still well protected. Okay, here we see keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. So the top surface here has been keratinized, so it has lots of the protein keratin in it, like on your heel. If you have like a callus, that would be a good example. So that's just providing lots of protection, because those outer layers can come off and it's no big deal. On places like your lips, you have much less of the keratin, but still many layers of that squamous epithelium. Okay, so most of the time when we see stratified epithelium, it is squamous. So lots of squashed little cells all stacked up. Stratified cuboidal would be 2 layers of cuboidal cells. Stratified columnar, likewise, would be columnar cells at the top, and then sort of a mishmash of sizes and shapes underneath. Both of them are incredibly rare in humans. Ducts of large glands, like pancreas, for instance, might have some, but they're rare. So know that they sort of exist, but that's it. Here's a nice picture of stratified cuboidal. Again, you can see the top, the apical cells are pretty nice cubes, but then underneath they're a little bit more squished. So these get a little harder to tell as well. Okay, next we have transitional epithelium. So this is a case where you can't totally tell the shape of the cells because they're dependent upon how the organ is stretched at the time. So the bladder, for instance, as it fills with urine, it stretches and gets bigger. And so this transitional epithelium that lines the bladder allows it to stretch out without damage. So you can see it looks a little bit cuboidal now, but as it stretches out, the cells are going to flatten. So again, function needs to stretch. So the structure is layers of these more cuboidal cells, and it can then stretch out to look more squamous. Okay, and here's a picture. So the apical surface is here, basal surface is here, and you can see kind of how there's all of these different layers, but then they can flatten out as it stretches. Okay, so last one is glandular epithelium. This is very general, and we'll talk about these more particularly when we talk about the endocrine system and when we talk about the skin in the case of exocrine glands. So, glandular epithelium makes up glands, of which there are two types. Endocrine glands, which we'll talk about the endocrine system as a whole later on in the year. And they are ductless and they secrete hormones. Exocrine glands have ducts and they empty to the epithelial surface. So like sweat glands and oil glands we'll talk about when we talk about the skin in the next unit. So just kind of be aware that these exist, and then we'll talk about them at a later time. Okay, so epithelial tissue, all done. Have a great day.